What I want to talk about is something that I don't think a lot of people have been talking about. And what I'm trying to focus on is a lot of subjects that I just haven't really heard discussed before, but I think are incredibly valid things to discuss. There's a lot of discussions that push focus in other directions. And I think that there are some very significant things that are indeed overlooked that are legitimate and are worth thinking about. And one of these things I think is, what are the signifiers of what makes a religion successful? Is it a approximation to truth, or is it something else? What does allow religion to continue on? Is it more than just its doctrine and its ritual? Is it more than its creed? Is it more than its writings? I think that's an interesting thing to look into, and I think it's something that people don't really discuss. So my question that I want to pose is, what if the most powerful religions in the world didn't survive because they were right? But what if they survived because they were built right? What if it had something to do with their structure? What if it had something to do with their luck? So I feel the need to crack open the sociology and history of religion in general, in human history, and use one of history's most dramatic disasters, something that I think is overlooked so much. Christian scholars definitely talk about the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, but I think when I was in the church, when I was a Christian, we didn't learn a whole lot about the destruction of the temple. And the destruction of the temple is actually a really important thing in the history of the church. I really want to dive into what it takes for a religion to survive, not just for a century, but for thousands of years. I'm going to propose that it almost has nothing at all to do with being correct. Let's start by taking a look at the religious leaderboard. I think that there are kind of 5 big players when it comes to religion. There's Christianity at about 2.5 billion. There's Islam, just shy of 2 billion. Hinduism, which is just over 1 billion. Buddhism, which is about 500 million. And then Judaism, which is around 15 million. So every single one of these have survived for at least 1,000 years. Several have lasted 3,000 years. Now, here's the question that should immediately occur to you. What do they have in common? Because theologically, they couldn't be more different, these religions. Buddhism doesn't require a creator or a god. Islam insists Jesus was just a prophet and he was not divine. Hinduism has millions of deities. Judaism rejects the New Testament. These traditions contradict each other in a lot of ways, and yet they all survived. When sociologists and historians look at long-lived, large membership religions, they do see some common properties across all of them. So something else must be going on than just their proximity to some sort of philosophical, religious, metaphysical truth. So what is the real architecture of survival for a religious movement? Because if truth isn't the variable that explains religious persistence, what is? Let's put it all together into 6 properties, the actual mechanisms that explain why religions endure. The first one is portability. The religion needs legs. It needs to be able to move. A faith that can only be practiced in a specific place is fragile. Every major surviving religion built its practice in habits, in texts, in communities, in forums, and places that can be picked up and carried anywhere. There is no fixed sacred geography required. Islam's prayer can be performed facing Mecca from any point on earth. You don't have to be in Mecca to be a Muslim. Christianity built its theology around scripture and the sacrament, and not stone and mortar. Judaism, after losing its temple, rebuilt itself around a sturdy and daily observance that could function in any household, in any city, on any continent. They aren't dependent on a specific temple, on a specific place. They're not specific to a person or a period of time. They are relevant to anyone, anywhere, at any time, and it is practicable by anyone, anywhere, at any time. Number 2, there is an institution. Institutions require you to dismantle more than just people, but structure. And that is so much harder. The Catholic Church's survival through the fall of Rome, the barbarian invasions, the Black Death, the Reformation, is testimony not to the truth that the Catholic's doctrine holds, but to the extraordinary durability of an organization that had outlasted the empire that gave it its legitimacy. Surviving religions developed stable, organized structures. Think about, there's priests, there's deacons, a chessboard full of different religious leaders. The Catholic Church may have the Pope, but there are other Christian denominations that also have very similar structures to the Catholic Church. Islam has a similar structure. Buddhism has these monastic orders. Judaism has rabbis and all these different academies. Institutions require that you dismantle the entire structure. It is more than just the people, it is the structure. It is a lot harder to get rid of that. Number 3, the high cost of jumping ship. This is the survival property that I think is the most human. Religions that embed themselves deeply in family structures and social networks, even observing holidays together. And that community isn't just a social net that is surrounding you. It is materially beneficial. Early Christian communities survived and grew partly because they took better care of their sick during plagues. If your community literally increases your odds of survival during a crisis, the demographics alone produce growth over time. This is the reason Catholics don't like birth control, is because if you are raised in a Catholic household, you are far more likely to continue on being Catholic than if you are not. They want people in their community to survive and do well because that continues that belief system. There is so much invested in good health and big families and happy, healthy families. Every major surviving religion built systems of mutual aid. The formula is simple. Make belonging valuable and make leaving devastating. If walking away from your religion means losing your family and your friends, your entire social identity, you're far more likely to reinterpret a doubt than to act on that doubt. Number 4, I'm going to say, is universalizing. And you'll see this in religions that restricted membership to maybe a certain ethnic group, a certain class. They hit a ceiling very quick. Paul's decision to open Christianity to Gentiles without requiring full compliance of Jewish law was a brilliant marketing ploy. From a pure growth standpoint, the single most consequential decision in Christianity was that it made Christianity infinitely scalable. It's a growth strategy. And then there's a capacity for reinterpretation. Every major religion has developed for their theology to be flexible, to absorb failed predictions, scientific challenges, and historical embarrassments without collapsing. The ability to reread a text, reframe a timeline, or declare something metaphorical rather than literal, scholars call this interpretive tradition. A tradition can be made compatible with any finding, any truth, anything that you can unearth, as long as it doesn't claim anything too specific. And this is what you're going to see, is any religion that centers around a specific place, a specific time, a very specific prophecy. Those are the religions that lose this advantage because they cannot fully reinterpret their core tenets, their core traditions into something else and survive what history may unveil. Religions that became rigid became brittle. The ones that can flex survive. The last one, all right, this one is just kind of sad, but true. Number 6 is not getting murdered. And I mean, it sounds silly and it sounds obvious, but I'm putting it on this list because it's genuinely underappreciated as a variable in religious survival. And history is full of counterexamples where it went catastrophically wrong. The Cathars were a Christian sect in southern France in the 12th and 13th centuries, theologically distinct, widely practiced with deep regional roots. Pope Innocent III, which is the most ironic name ever for a pope, launched a military crusade against them in 1209. The crusade lasted 20 years and killed somewhere between like 200,000 and 1 million people. We're not quite sure. But the Cathars after this crusade ceased to exist, not because their theology failed, but because they were murdered by the Pope's army. And then there's the Aztec religious system, which was incredibly elaborate, incredibly deep. It had complex cosmology, extensive hierarchies, a rich calendar tradition that if you lived through 2012, you know a little bit about. But it was dismantled in a matter of decades following a Spanish conquest, which combined military destruction with just burning all of their shit down and murdering them. The religion didn't lose a theological debate. It lost a war. Then there's the Manichaeans, followers of the prophet Mani, who synthesized not just Zoroastrianism, Christianity, but also Buddhism into a genuinely global religion that spread from North Africa all the way to China. And they were systematically targeted by every major empire of the time. The Roman Empire persecuted them. The Sassanid Empire executed Mani himself in 274 by flaying him. The Tang dynasty burned his believers in China. These people were hunted. This religion didn't collapse, it was hunted to extinction across multiple continents over several centuries. The pattern here is pretty blunt. A religion that becomes someone else's political problem has a survival disadvantage, and no amount of good theology is going to overcome that if that person is powerful enough and willing to take you down. Portability, kenotial texts, institutional hierarchy, none of it matters if the institution gets physically destroyed and its leaders get executed. This is also why the geographic spread of a religion matters so much. A faith that is confined to one region can be wiped out just by one demented ruler very quickly and easily. But a faith that's distributed across 10 empires is nearly impossible to exterminate, which is precisely why Christianity's rapid geographic spread and Islam's explosive early expansion were structural survival advantages. You can't kill an idea that's already on 3 continents. Well, unless of course you're the Manichaeans. It took a lot of time, but they murdered the crap out of those people. Now, let's look at some failures, the movements that didn't make it very far. And they all share a similar profile. They were location dependent. I'm talking a religion whose entire practice is housed in a single building. Elitism. Salvation is restricted to the spiritually advanced. That doesn't scale. Like Gnosticism was all about you have to be one of the enlightened. If you say only smart people are going to heaven, you're not going to convert a lot of people. The next one is the death of a charismatic figure. So this happened a lot with the failed messiahs around Jesus' time. Jesus was not the only person who claimed to be Messiah. And according to the Jewish people, Jesus also failed, just like all these other guys who got decapitated, put into hiding. These guys, once they died or was put into exile, their whole movement disappeared. And then making someone far more powerful than you really mad at you. If you get murdered and all your followers get murdered, guess what? Your movement is done. And it's as simple as that. So I want you to keep those things in mind because I'm about to show how all of these play out in real time. So let's rewind all the way back to 70 AD in Jerusalem. The Roman general Titus, he besieges the city, breaches the walls, and burns the temple to the ground. Now, what's funny is King Herod actually thought that the temple of Jerusalem was like the most beautiful thing he's ever seen. Anyone who saw this temple would agree that this building was gorgeous, and no one actually wanted to burn down the temple. But when General Titus came and besieged the city, they liked to start a lot of fires, and they accidentally burnt down the temple. And it was a catastrophic event. The religious ecosystem of an entire civilization failed right then and there. This is, by the way, for historians and biblical scholars, as close to a controlled experiment as history has ever provided. Before this, first century Judaism was not a monolith. The common modern image of Judaism as a single unified tradition is a product of this temple burning down. Before the temple burned, there was at minimum like 5 significant competing Jewish movements, all reading the same Torah, all worshiping the same God, disagreeing loudly about everything else. And it's really important to note here that amongst all of these sects, the destruction of the temple hit all of these people in a very different way. It was a targeted extinction event that was lethal to the temple dependent, but survivable for the portable. There were the Sadducees, and these were the first ones to go. They ran the temple, and they were entirely dependent on the temple. When that thing burnt down, they were done. There are no Sadducees today because there is simply nothing a Sadducees could do without a temple. Then there were the Essenes, and these were like desert monks, and they were really big into the apocalypse. They were destroyed by Rome. The military just crushed these people. They actually got destroyed in 68 AD, 2 years before the temple got burnt down. They spent generations preparing for an apocalyptic war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. The war came, and they lost the war. They got murdered by Roman soldiers. And then there were the Zealots and the Sicarii. The Sicarii were named after the daggers that they would use to assassinate people in crowds. These were like revolutionary fighters. These were the people who were protesting, boots to the ground. And they made their last stand 3 years after the temple fell. Their theology required something to liberate. With no temple and no state, the ideology just had no subject. They didn't really have anything to base their entire movement on, because it was all about the Jewish state, and that was gone. So ultimately, only 2 movements survived, and that is the Pharisees, who are now what we call just Jewish people. And they had always been the most portable Jewish sect. They have survived, going through the desert, and they survived being taken over by the Babylonians. They have survived a lot of crazy things. One of the Pharisees was a scholar named Yohanan ben Zakkai. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. He escaped the city, and tradition says, by being smuggled out in a coffin, which I think is crazy, and obtained Roman permission to establish an academy at the coastal town of Yavain. What happened there was one of the most remarkable acts of institutional recovery in religious history. The rabbis systematically replaced every element of temple-based worship with a portable equivalent. The temple altar became just a family dinner table. Animal sacrifice just became prayer and studying the Torah. Hereditary priests just became a learned rabbi. It was earned and not inherited. One sacred location, the temple, became any place Jewish people gathered. And then the annual pilgrimage to Jerusalem was just a daily study circle, which could happen in any city anywhere. This was deliberate, and this was an institutional design that was made under crisis, something that Jewish people were not unfamiliar with at that time. They've been dealing with crisis throughout their entire history. The theological argument they made, study is equivalent to sacrifice. Prayer is equivalent to offering. Every form of Judaism practiced today, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Hadistic, I think those are the 4, is a direct institutional descendant of what those scholars built at Yavain. Then there's the early Christians. And they had solved the portability problem before the temple was even destroyed. The stones that made up the temple in Jerusalem was just irrelevant to the community that had already relocated its sacred center into a person, a text, and a network of other communities. Paul had spent 20 years building these communities from Antioch to Corinth to Rome before Jerusalem was destroyed. When the center fell, the network, it was already there. And the Gospel of Mark, written during or immediately after the revolt, who knows, shows Jesus predicting the temple's destruction in specific terms. Whether that was genuine prophecy or retrospective writing is up for debate. But its effect was powerful. It gave Christians a narrative in which the disaster that destroyed their competition had been foreseen by their founder. And that is almost a perfect survivability tool. But what about the truth? Now here's where it gets philosophically interesting and a little uncomfortable. There's an argument you'll hear from theologians and apologists all alike, and it goes roughly like this. Christianity began with a dead leader, publicly humiliated by Rome. No institutional backing, no military power, and yet it grew. It grew to encompass 2 billion people and shape every major civilization it touched. This scale of growth demands an explanation. Here's the fatal problem. If survival were evidence of truth, we'd expect just one religion, the true one, to survive and grow dramatically. Instead, we have Islam, which holds that Jesus was a prophet but not divine, that God has no son, and the Quran is God's final revelation. Christianity, however, holds that Jesus was God. Buddhism makes no claim to a creator God at all. These claims directly contradict each other, but they all can't be true, and yet all 3 have demonstrated extraordinary survival and growth across radically different cultures and historical periods. If survival is evidence of truth, and Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism all survive in massive scale with mutually exclusive truth claims, then survival arguments prove nothing, or it proves everything. which amounts to kind of the same thing, really. And it gets worse, because when you look at the actual historical record, the moments that most shaped Christian survival often had nothing to do with truth at all. The earliest Christian communities did not expect to build a civilization. They expected the imminent return of Jesus within their own lifetimes. And this isn't something that I'm trying to float as a conspiracy theory. This is something that Jesus said himself in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9. He says, "Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God come with power." That is not something someone who believes that the Christ is coming back in 2,000 years would say. Paul, he wrote to the Thessalonians around 50 AD, fully expecting to be alive for the return of Christ. The generation he addressed, they died. The return did not come. The central temporal claim of the earliest Christian community was falsified within a single person's living memory. The movement, however, did not collapse. It adapted. The any moment now of Paul became the in God's time of later theology. The apocalyptic urgency of the earliest communities became institutional stability. A failed prediction in a community with strong mutual bonds and a flexible theology, often it strengthens rather than destroys that movement. Now let's talk about the Council of Nicaea, the most fundamental doctrine of mainstream Christianity. The Trinity, and specifically the full divinity of Jesus, was not self-evident in the early church. It was a contested claim that nearly went the other way, and the mechanism that settled it was not a theological argument. It was imperial power. Arius, a priest from Alexandria, argued that Jesus was not the greatest of God's creations. He was not co-equal with the Father. He was not eternal in the same sense that God was. This was not, by the way, a fringe view. At various points in the 4th century, Arius and his followers commanded the loyalty of multiple emperors and the majority of bishops across the Eastern Empire. A historian at the time captures it perfectly. He said, "The world woke up one day and found itself Arian." The Council of Nicaea in 325, convened by Emperor Constantine, declared Arianism heresy. But Constantine's primary concern was just the unity of his empire, not metaphysics, not anything divine. This idea that Jesus was God and that he was part of a Trinity, it won because Constantine backed it and his successors ultimately backed it as well. The doctrine of the Trinity, the cornerstone of Christian orthodoxy, was settled by an emperor who outlasted other emperors. That's it. And now let's talk about the biblical canon. The Bible did not fall from heaven in its current form. It was assembled through centuries of human selection, debate, and institutional decision-making. Different communities used different texts. Some texts now in the canon were disputed for centuries. Some texts now excluded were widely revered. The Orthodox canon, which we use today, is not the first canon either. There were other churches, there were other sects of Christianity that had completely different canons, and actually, those canons implied a very different set of beliefs. The Epistle of Barnabas appeared in one of the earliest Christian Bibles, and that is now excluded. The Epistle of James came close to exclusion. Luther called it an epistle made of straw. Revelation was disputed for centuries, and I think rightly so, and it is still not part of the canon in some Eastern churches. The Ethiopian Orthodox Bible includes books not found in the Protestant or Catholic Bibles, which, by the way, those two differ as well. The canon that billions of people today treat as divinely inspired words of God was determined by fallible human beings working in specific political and theological contexts, using criteria that changed over time, reaching different conclusions in different traditions for different reasons. And a lot of those reasons were just simply political ones. And let's talk about this. Paganism. It was absorbed by Christianity, and it was not argued against. Christianity's growth was not accomplished by debating and defeating competing belief systems through arguments. It was accomplished largely by absorbing their symbols and practices. I think about the concept of logos. Jesus was the Word, and the Word and God were one, blah, blah, blah. That concept is something that was taken externally. This was not something that was invented by one of the epistles. This was something that was borrowed from another culture. A lot of people know Christmas is something that doesn't appear in any biblical text. It was formalized in the 4th century and corresponds with the Roman festival of Sol Invictus. Christian writers acknowledged that this was a little awkward. In the 3rd century, they question whether Jesus' birthday should even be observed at all. Then there's, of course, Easter, another one that we took from the pagans, which is more a spring fertility festival across Germanic and Celtic cultures than it is anything to do with Jesus' birth. The veneration of the saints, each associated with specific places and protective functions, served the same psychological role as the local protective deities of pre-Christian religions. In region after region, Christianity grew not by proving that paganism was wrong, but by offering Christian versions of what paganism already provided. Calendar anchors, protective figures, sacred places, communal rituals, all of these things. They just put a new label on it. That's it. That is not a commitment to truth. That is a masterclass in competitive substitution and survival. So what does the survival of Christianity or Islam or Judaism or Buddhism actually prove? The fact that they've been around for so long, what does that say about them? Does it say that they are stewards of some deep metaphysical truth about God and the universe, and only they, because of their endurance, are proven to have access to that truth? No. The destruction of the Second Temple reveals, perhaps more clearly than any other event in history, that survival for a religion is a function of structure and not content. The Sadducees, they had content, arguably more historically authentic content than the Pharisees, but they didn't have structure, and they were gone within a generation. There were religions that had intense communities, intense commitments, intense claims to the truth. And they were destroyed because someone who was in power at the time thought that their existence was just inconvenient. And consider the Ebionites, possibly the most historically authentic version of the Jesus movement. These were Jewish followers of a Jewish Messiah, keeping Jewish law, and they rejected a lot of the elaborations of Paul. They were squeezed out of existence precisely because they would not adapt. Their fidelity to what they understood as truth made them unacceptable to both the Christian communities that survived and the Jewish communities that survived. Their authenticity was institutionally their death sentence. The religion that survives is not necessarily the one that holds on to the truth the most dearly. However, I do want to say that that doesn't mean that y'all should go out and be atheists now, because that's not what I'm trying to say here. Now, a theist could coherently respond that the survival properties were embedded in the true religion precisely because truth, to be universally accessible, must be universally transmissible. I've heard this before. But it also concedes to my central point, which is that the survival properties, not the truth claims, are what actually drove the outcome. For 2,000 years, the ruins of a temple have sat in Jerusalem. 3 religions claim that that ground is holy in kind of different ways. None of them worship as the priests there once did. The religion that once filled that building is gone. 2 religions that claim to supersede it live on, not because they were right about God, but because they were right about how human communities work. In the long run, that turned out to matter more. So if you believe in Christianity, or if you are a Buddhist, or if you are a Muslim, because, well, everyone else is, if you believe that what they say is true because just so many other people say it, you will see that there were a lot of people, a lot of earnest people, who were just trying to do what they felt in their minds and in their hearts was the right thing. They were trying to build communities. They were trying to make a religion that made sense to them. There are so many communities in the early church, and some of them we're not even sure if they even existed, but all of them were looking for a way to make Jesus mean something to them. And they did it in a lot of different ways. There was not one form of Christianity. There was not one form of Judaism after the temple fell. There was a lot of soul searching that needed to be done to create a religion that could stick, to create a religion that had legs. And that took time, that took adaptability, that took some failed attempts. And that's how we arrived at where we are today. And I think what's so important is the more you study about this, the more you realize that truth, that accuracy, that first-person accounts of what had happened weren't as important as just the community's ability to adapt to what was going on at that time. If God is real, and God intended a message to reach all people across all of history, then that message, it makes sense, must necessarily have the properties required to travel across all of history. It must be portable, it must be adaptable, it must be capable of surviving failures and catastrophes. It must create communities of genuine care, not as accidents of design, but because truth, to be universally acceptable, must be universally transmissible. It is hard to determine whether or not these traits are evidence against divine origin. They're possibly evidence for it. A message from the God who created human communities should naturally speak to how human communities work. There was a very early narrative in the Christian church that Jesus was crucified, the tomb was empty, people claimed to have seen him afterwards, and that was established before any institution could benefit from it. So if your argument is that God used those survival mechanisms to keep his truth alive for thousands of years, to carry the truth of the gospel, any religion that harbors the truth would also need those traits. 2 billion members and 2,000 years of history prove that Christianity is at the very least robust. They don't, however, prove that it's true, and they don't prove that it isn't. What they do show is this: the earliest followers of Jesus, working in the ruins of the world that was destroyed in 70 AD, they built something that could survive anything.